It gives me immense pleasure to introduce the next resource person, Dr. P. Puneeth. He is an associate professor of law in the Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He obtained his BAL and LLB 5 years integrated course degree, LLM and PhD from Bangalore University, Karnataka. And his teaching and research areas of interest include constitution and administrative law, judicial process, law and justice in a globalizing world, and criminal law. And his doctoral work was on the topic Impact of Global Regulatory Regime on Indian Constitution, a Critical Study. Dr. Puneeth published number of papers in journals of national and international repute, including Journal of Indian Law Institute, Jindal Global Law Review, Daily Law Review, Chanakya National Law Review, University Law Journal, SAGE, Social Change, and Seminar. And it is his wonderful contribution on judicial review, process, powers, and problems. One of the articles has been contributed to the Festschrift, which was brought out in honor of Professor Upendra Bakshi recently, and it's published by Cambridge University Press recently. And he is also a regular contributor for the annual survey of Indian law. Dr. Puneeth participated in several national and international seminars, conferences, and presented papers. And he also delivered number of addresses as the invited plenary speaker, number of keynote addresses in couple of such seminars. And he invited number of, in fact, he delivered number of invited lectures on, various platforms. And recently, he delivered a lecture on, prestigious lecture series organized by the Nehru Museum, Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi, on the topic Judiciary in a Democracy, Spotlights on Judicial Activism in India. And before joining the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. Puneeth served in the Indian Law Institute, ILI, the premier institute for legal research and higher education in the country since 2006 as an assistant professor of law, and also served as a member of the Board of Studies and Academic Council of Indian Law Institute. He worked as the assistant editor of the prestigious Journal of the Indian Law Institute. And he delivered a series of lectures. He has been honorary visiting faculty at Jindal Global Law School, and he offered several seminar courses at National Law University, Delhi. And he was also a member of the editorial advisory board of the Journal of the Faculty of Law, Modi University, Rajasthan, member, Board of Studies, Amity University, Jaipur, previously. And it is my privilege to introduce my good friend, Dr. P. Puneeth, a wonderful speaker. And the organizers have thought that Dr. Puneeth is the right person to speak on the topic, the effective learning, teaching, and in fact, research in law, especially on new education policy, legal education, and its impact, because new education policy has left out two important streams. One is legal education, the other one is medical education. And we couldn't find anyone better than Dr. Puneeth to deliver this address. We welcome you to Usman University, Dr. Puneeth.
Thank you very much, sir, for the kind and more detailed introduction. And a very warm good evening to all of you. I am really glad to participate as a resource person in this online workshop. It is for the first time that I have been participating in an academic event organized by the Department of Law of the Osmania University. I thank the coordinators of the workshop, Dr. Gali Vinod Kumar and Professor Pant Nayak, for giving me the opportunity. And I more particularly thank Professor G.B. Reddy, on whose reference I have been invited to this workshop. Professor Reddy has been my PhD examiner. He has examined my thesis somewhere in the year 2013. And we have had the opportunity of being co-panelist in a couple of seminars or discussion forums. So I'm extremely glad to participate in this event where he is one of the senior member of the faculty. Have been asked to share my thoughts on the impact of national education policy 2020 on legal education. As all of you know, the NEP 2020 has been recently approved and proclaimed by the Union Cabinet. It is currently being widely discussed in different circles. I assume that most of you may have already perused the policy out of curiosity to understand what kind of transformation it has envisioned for legal education in India. And someone more experienced, more knowledgeable, and more wiser than me invited to speak on the topic, I'm sure he or she would have done more justice to the topic than what I could do. But since it is fell to my lot, let me try my best to explain it. When we talk about policy in general, let me begin by saying that the government policies are generally unwritten. We do not have written policies on every area or subject matters. Even on subjects as important as international relations or national security, we do not have officially proclaimed foreign policy or national security policy, or now what is called as national security doctrine. Only on certain subject matters, we do have officially proclaimed for policies. For example, on environment, we have a policy called National Environmental Policy. We have a forest policy, industrial policies, disaster management policies. These are some of the policies where we find a written document which has been framed and announced by the governments. As far as education is concerned, there were two other policies adopted in the past, and the NEP 2020, which we are discussing today, is the third education policy adopted since independence. Most of you may know, the first one was adopted in 1968 based on the Kothari Commission recommendation. And the second policy was adopted in the year 1986 during the Rajiv Gandhi's period, which was later revised in 1992. It is after 34 years, if you look at from 1986 to 2020, that a new education policy has been framed and proclaimed by the government. Generally speaking, policies are vision statements as to how the government intends to transform or bring about changes in a particular field. They contain broad and general principles and framework. One thing that we must understand at the outset is that policies proclaimed by the government do not have legal force. They are not binding legal instruments. No one can seek to enforce them through the court of law. Nor can the government be held accountable legally for not implementing those policies that they themselves have framed and announced. At best, policies can be said to reflect loose commitments of the governments. When a particular policy is announced, it doesn't mean that it is going to be binding on the government and the government is going to implement it forthwith, almost every aspect of what the policy proposes. It only reflects a loose commitment of the government. Any policy requires concrete state actions, either legislative or executive, depending on the case, for their implementation. Like most other policies, national education policy also contains broad and general principles and framework. It lays down transformative roadmap for school, college, and university educations. It has been well received as a good policy document in many circles. There are only few criticisms and certain details or lack thereof, but broadly the policy is well received and appreciated. It proposes to comprehensively transform existing education system at all levels. We are concerned today with what kind of impact it would have on legal education in India. Though there can be no accurate projection of the future based on the broad and general policy outlines, since they can be implemented in many ways, there are certain things that can be identified and flagged. If one cursorily looks at the National Education Policy, which is a very short and crisp document of about 62 pages, there are only a couple of explicit references to legal education. Professor G.B. Reddy has already mentioned one of them while introducing the topic. That is, when it talks about governance and regulatory changes, that the new education policy provides for complete overhauling of the existing system and establishment of what is called a Higher Education Commission of India, which would have 4 verticals within it, one relating to regulation, the other relating to accreditation, third relating to funding, and the fourth relating to setting of standards. As Professor G.B. Reddy rightly mentioned, that the new education policy excludes legal education from the first vertical within the Higher Education Commission of India. And I'll come to it a little later. So that's the one important area where the legal education is explicitly mentioned. The second is in the part 3 of the education policy, which deals with several aspects. Professional education has been specifically dealt with, and there is an exclusive paragraph devoted to the legal education as regards to professional education is concerned. I'll come to that also in the due course. But what is important for us to understand, it is not sufficient for us to refer only to those paragraphs or sub-paragraphs to understand the impact of national education policy and legal education in India. We cannot only refer to those provisions, those paras or sub-paras where there is an explicit reference to legal education, and then try to understand what kind of impact the national education policy would have on the legal education as a whole. As we know, all universities and colleges imparting legal education are higher education institutions. It is important for us to understand the transformational roadmap laid down in the national education policy for higher education in general. Then only we will be able to understand the true implications of the policy and the legal education as well. Only after reading the policy as a whole, one can understand the overall implications on the legal education. So it is in this context that we need to look at the entire legal education policy and identify the important aspects which would have implications on the legal education as well. And reading the policy, I have identified and intend to flag some of the important points from the national education policy, which would have implications on the legal education. Number one, when we talk about impact on legal education, what needs to be understood is that the main thrust of the national education policy regarding higher education is to end fragmentation of higher education by transforming all higher education institutions into multidisciplinary universities, colleges, or clusters or knowledge hubs. Moving to large multidisciplinary universities and higher education institution clusters is the highest recommendation of this policy regarding the structure of higher education in India. The policy specifically states that professional education shall become integrated part of the overall higher education system, and thus standalone universities and institutions, including the legal education universities or institutions, shall become multidisciplinary institutions by 2030. This is the most important policy change announced by the new education policy. So according to this policy, many of the existing legal education institutions or universities cannot exist as silos imparting only legal education. As all of us know, currently there are varieties of institutions offering legal education. They can be broadly categorized into three groups. Number one, constituent colleges of state, central, or private universities. Mostly, these universities are multidisciplinary universities. And the departments or faculties of law exist within such multidisciplinary setup. And they need not undergo any structural changes because of the policy, because of the new education policy, because they are already multidisciplinary institutions. And Department of Laws, or the faculties of law, as we may call now, exist within such a setup. And they're already in conformity with what the national education policy envisioned of making every educational institutions multidisciplinary and large institutions. Unless if there are any universities, particularly the private universities, which are monodisciplinary, having one or two, three disciplines, offering courses in some of the disciplines which may not fit into the definition of monodisciplinary university that the national education policy has adopted. The rest of the universities, in my opinion, actually fit into the definition of a multidisciplinary university, and legal educational institutions existing as constituent colleges or departments within such universities need not have to undergo any structural changes as such. But the constituent colleges or departments of law existing within the multidisciplinary state, central, or private universities are not the only educational institutions offering legal education. In fact, the trend now is towards establishing a monodisciplinary universities for offering legal education called national law schools and national law universities. Currently, there are 24 of them, to the best of my knowledge. Almost every state has a monodisciplinary university offering legal education. Every state has a national law school. Some of the states do have more than one national law school. They are all standalone universities, even though some of them offer MBA or MBL degrees, like the Nalsar offers, I heard, MBA degrees in addition to the law degree. And the National Law School of India University, Bangalore offers MBL degree, Master of Business Laws, in addition to the regular law degrees. Just because they happen to offer one or two additional degrees in slightly different and are allied disciplines, they cannot be considered to be a multidisciplinary university as envisioned under the national education policy. According to the NEP, university by definition shall mean, I quote, a multidisciplinary institution of higher learning that offers undergraduate and postgraduate programs with high quality teaching, research, and community engagement. There must be disciplinary courses that are being offered by the same educational institutions. So institutions offering couple of professional and commercially viable degree programs cannot call themselves a multidisciplinary university as envisioned under the national education policy. So none of the national law universities would fit into the definition of multidisciplinary university. They need complete restructuring and dramatic expansion over a period of time. They, in fact, also fixed the timeline till 2030 or so, within which these standalone monodisciplinary universities must become multidisciplinary higher educational institutions, which are large, having at least 3,000 students. This is what the aim of the national education policies. So, in view of the national education policy, I think first and the foremost thing that we must do is to reflect upon the idea of monodisciplinary national law schools that are actually proliferating these days. Almost every state, now with the exception of 1 or 2 states, have a national law universities established, which are basically monodisciplinary universities. Only some have ventured into allied disciplines, but they do not make them just because they ventured into the allied disciplines. They cannot be considered as a multidisciplinary university, so that there is a need now to revisit the very idea of establishing monodisciplinary universities for imparting legal education. That is the second important aspect. And moving further, apart from the constituent colleges, which I spoke about before, and the national law universities, there are also what are called standalone government or private colleges affiliated to the universities. Maximum number of law graduates come from such colleges. There are more than 1,000 law colleges in India, and most of them are standalone institutions. As per the national education policy, even such colleges should also become multidisciplinary institutions, or if they are too small to become multidisciplinary institutions, they must join together with other institutions to form higher education institution clusters. The national education policy also contemplates about the higher education institutional clusters. And if the university cannot over a period of time become, if a college or an institution cannot become over a period of time a multidisciplinary higher education institutions, the only way for them to survive as such is to join the cluster of higher education institutions, which makes them multidisciplinary. At least the cluster as a whole becomes multidisciplinary, and such institutions can survive. So this is one of the major impacts of the national education policy and legal education, which requires certain structural changes to the existing institutional framework, existing institutions that are offering legal education in the country. The second important change that the national education policy has proposed, which would have implications on legal education system as well, is to do away with the system of affiliation of colleges in the long run. As I said before, most of the legal educational institutions in India are standalone private or government colleges that are affiliated to state or central university. The national education policy proposes that each such college should either get integrated into a university or become autonomous and independent self-governing degree granting institutions are clustered within the next 15 years. Granting of autonomy and degree granting power will be contingent on the compliance with the requirements and meeting the standards to be set up by appropriate authorities. So the existing government and private law colleges, which are affiliated to different state or central universities, would have a humongous task ahead to become autonomous and independent degree granting higher education institutions in course of time within 15 years, which means to say by 2035, that the national education policy intends to abolish the system of affiliations. Now that most of the colleges that exist are either affiliated to the state university or to the central universities. Of course, the national law universities do not grant affiliations, and they do not have, under the statute, the authority to grant affiliation. It is either the state or the central universities, which in general grant affiliation to the other government or private law colleges, and there are plenty of them. More than 1,000 such colleges exist. And in fact, it is only such colleges which are producing more number of law graduates compared to the constituent colleges or even the national law universities as a whole. So there is an humongous task ahead of them to become autonomous, independent degree granting universities, that they themselves can grant degrees without being affiliated to any particular universities, but there will be standards, there will be requirements that are set which needs to be met. So these colleges that are existing would have to comply with those standards and requirements that are going to be set to claim the autonomy which the national education policy intended to grant. And there is a deadline that is fixed for that under the policy, which is 2035. So within 15 years, that these institutions need to transform themselves into an independent autonomous colleges. In certain states in India, there are exclusive affiliating universities established for the purpose of granting affiliation to law colleges. For example, in the state of Tamil Nadu, they have Tamil Nadu Ambedkar Law University, and in the state of Karnataka, they have Karnataka State Law University, which was established in Hubli. Even though they're offering some courses, they're basically administrative universities. They only grant affiliation to various government and private colleges comes under their jurisdiction, like the Karnataka State Law University has a jurisdiction over the entire state, excepting for the national law schools and the university's constituent colleges. All other legal education institutions are bound to seek affiliation from the Karnataka State Law University only. And the university only grants affiliation, conducts examination, and grants degrees to the students. If you look at the national education policy, it contemplates only two kinds of universities, either teaching intensive university or research intensive university. So it contemplates two kinds of universities. The idea of affiliating university which mainly discharges administrative function does not find any place within the national education policy, so that the states where such exclusive affiliating universities exist may have to revisit and then convert them into actual either teaching intensive or research intensive university, and not monodisciplinary but multidisciplinary universities, in order to keep those universities functional. So that is another important changes that the national education policy actually proposes. The third important impact and national education of the national education policy and legal education is about the eligibility to join the LLB degree programs. Who will be eligible to join law? Now, student can pursue legal education either after +2 or after graduation. There are two streams, as all of us know. 5-year integrated LLB program and a 3-year integrated LLB program, which are offered by national law schools and traditional universities. Mostly all national law schools offer only 5-year integrated program, and it is only either the university constituent colleges or some of the government or private colleges which offer 3-year integrated programs as well. Students after their 10+2, either in science, arts, or commerce stream, can enroll for 5-year courses under the existing system. In many universities, students who had pursued job-oriented courses or occasional courses after their 10th standard are not eligible to enroll for 5-year integrated courses. Now, the NEP is proposing to obliterate odd separation among arts, humanities, science, or between vocational and academic streams. That there will be no such art separation, which we now find generally in many of the states. After the 10th standard itself, the student is expected to enroll in a particular stream, arts, science, or commerce, or whatever streams that are there, and pursue education accordingly. And in addition to these three main streams, there is also a vocational education that exists. And there is a hard separation between these main streams and the occasional education. And within this mainstreams, there is also a separation between arts, science, and commerce. And we only allow those who have pursued the 10+2 in the academic stream after 10th standard, if they have done their +2 either in any one of these main academic streams, then they will be eligible to enroll for the LLB course, the 5-year LLB course. But the national education policy proposes to obliterate that distinction between the academic and the occasional streams, which means to say that the policy that we are now following of excluding the students who have pursued job-oriented courses after 10th standard for the 2 years, which are called JOCs in some states, or the occasional courses, they cannot be excluded, ideally speaking, from enrolling into 5-year LLB courses. So that is another important area where we find some impact of the national education policy and legal education. And when it comes to 3-year LLB program, as per the existing eligibility criteria, any person who has a graduation degree in any discipline, science, arts, or commerce, engineering, or medicine, can join the 3-year course. Now the national education policy has proposed drastic changes to the structure and length of the undergraduate degree program. It proposes undergraduate degree of either 3 or 4-year duration with multiple exit options within this period with appropriate certification. If you look at the national education policy, it provides that if a person is enrolled for an undergraduate program, if he completes 1 year and could not continue further, you would get a certificate. If a person completes 2 years and could not continue further, you would get a diploma certificate. And if a person completes 3 years, you would get a degree certificate. And then there is also a new category, which is in fact much preferred option as per the national education policy itself. That is multidisciplinary bachelor degree of 4 years. A 4-year program may also lead to a degree with research. In some cases, if the student completes a rigorous research project in their major areas of study, then they can also get a 4-year degree with research. So, of course, as far as the 3-year LLB degree is concerned, based on a certificate or a diploma procured after 1 or 2 years, no one can seek admission to the LLB 3-year LLB degree. But now that there are 2 kinds of degrees that would be existing, one will be a 3-year degree and the other would be a 4-year multidisciplinary degree, either with research or without research component. Now, when there are 2 kinds of degrees that are going to exist in future, who will be eligible to enroll for a 3-year LLB program? Is it a person with a 3-year degree, undergraduate degree who will be eligible, or a person with a 4-year undergraduate degree only will be eligible to enroll for law, or both of them will be eligible to enroll for law? This is one of the important aspects that needs to be looked into in course of time when we think about eligibility to enroll for a 3-year LLB degree program. Further, there is also a new degree which was, of course, introduced in the year 2013, which the national education policy recognizes, that is called BVOC degree, Bachelor of Occasional Degree, who have done occasional courses in their graduation. So, will they also be eligible to enroll for a 3-year LLB degree after completing their Bachelor of Occasional courses? Generally, so far, the occasional courses were excluded from the eligibility criteria to enroll for a law. But now that it is recognized and the odd separation between disciplines are obliterated, kind of, or sought to be obliterated, then we may have to even think of allowing the persons with Bachelor of Vocational degree to enroll for an undergraduate degree program. That is the third important aspect as regards the eligibility criteria to enroll for the law. The fourth important change that the legal education may have to undergo in view of the national education policy is with regard to multiple exit options. As I said, the national education policy specifically provides for multiple exit options at the undergraduate level. One of the questions we should also look into for understanding the impact of NEP and legal education is that should there be multiple exit options in the undergraduate LLB degree programs as well? We have, of course, there is no such explicit mentioning in the national education policy that even the professional courses must provide for it. But it is one of the important things that needs to be explored. It is possible that because all provisions relating to higher education would apply for legal education as well, in addition to whatever they have proposed under the specific heading relating to the professional education. Even legal education institutions may have to think of providing for multiple exit options and providing for certificates of diploma for those students who exit in between without completing the LLB degree, either 5-year or a 3-year degree. And the national education policy also provides for establishment of an academic bank of credit, that if a student has completed 1 year of degree and could not continue further, not only that he would be given a certificate, he can also deposit his, or rather all his credits that he has earned in that particular degree, the particular year, would get deposited in the academic bank of credit that is going to be created. And he can subsequently enroll either in the same higher education institution or in a different higher education institution to complete his degree further. Should even the legal education institutions also make such provisions for students to enroll and have multiple exit options to exit without completing the entire degree at once and re-enroll subsequently in the same higher education institution or in the different higher education institutions? And for those who exited in between, should they be given either a certificate or a diploma, as a certificate in law or a diploma in law, which may not, of course, make them eligible to practice law as advocates, but they are certificate courses, but they can subsequently re-enroll and then complete the degree, and then they can practice or do anything else which they will be eligible for after completing a degree. So this is another important aspect which needs to be taken into account. The fifth important implication on legal education is that there are certain explicit prescription for professional legal education, in particular in the national education policy. What I so far spoke about, excepting for the first aspect that I mentioned about all national law schools becoming multidisciplinary universities, which is also explicit prescription. The other things I have talked about so far are general for the higher education institutions, which would have implications for the legal education as well. In addition, under the national education policy, there are certain explicit prescriptions for professional legal education in particular. Number one, the national education policy states that the legal education needs to be competitive globally, adopting best practices and embracing new technologies for wider access to and timely delivery of justice. Number two, it must be informed and illuminated with constitutional values of justice, social, economic, and political, and direct towards national reconstruction through instrumentation of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And three, the curricula for legal studies must reflect socio-cultural context along with, in an evidence-based manner, the history of legal thinking, principles of justice, the practice of jurisprudence, and other related content appropriately and adequately. And number four, that institutions of law education must consider offering bilingual education for future lawyers and judges in English and in the language of the state in which the institution is situated. These are the four important prescriptions which are prescribed in a single paragraph, number 20.4 in the national education policy, for the legal education in particular. The last one is very important. Of course, as regards the first three are concerned, it has always been emphasized upon, and to some extent, the existing courses in law incorporate these aspects. But if there are any lacking that needs to be looked into, and the courses or the degree programs needs to be appropriately revised, so that the both 5-year and a 3-year undergraduate degree is brought in conformity with the mandates of the National Education Policy. But the fourth one I am emphasizing particularly, because the National Education Policy obligates only the state institutions and not the national or central institutions to offer bilingual education. As regards probably the national law universities are concerned, or the central universities are concerned, there is no such obligation imposed upon them to offer legal education in a bilingual way. But the state universities have been obligated to offer the legal education in 2 languages, one in English as well as in the regional language of the state. It may be a difficult task having regard to the fact that most of the authoritative legal literature is available only in English. If you look at the statutes in particular, which are passed by the Union Parliament, they're generally passed in English. Now in India as well, there is an English and an English version that the Gazette generally publishes after passing of the statute. And I'm sure even in the states, probably the state legislations are passed in the English as well as in the regional languages. But the central laws are not available, are not officially made available in the regional languages. Number 2, that it is only recently that even the Supreme Court has started translating the judgments of the Supreme Court in regional languages. The judgments rendered by the court so far, that it is only last year or so, late 2018 or so, they started translating the judgments into some of the regional languages and not to all the regional languages. But the judgments that are rendered but till then, from 1950 to till then, or sometimes even we may have to refer to the judgments rendered by the Privy Council and the federal courts. And most of these judgments are available only in English, unless these judgments are translated and made available in all regional languages. Then the necessary legal literature that is required for anyone to effectively pursue legal education will not be available in the local language. So unless it is done, it may be difficult for the state universities to offer legal education in 2 languages. But one important aspect that we should note is that the National Education Policy is proposing to establish Indian Institute of Translation and Interpretation, which should on priority, in case if they really want to realize the legal education in 2 languages, imparting of legal education in 2 languages for future lawyers and judges, then on priority basis, this National Institute of Translation and Interpretation should undertake translation of legal literature, most importantly statutes and judgments of the court, to all 8 scheduled languages. Then only bilingual education in law is possible, or else it would be very difficult. Or if you rely upon only a substandard textbooks that are available in the regional languages, probably will end up producing substandard lawyers and judges. So it is important to ensure that all the important legal literature are available in all regional languages before implementing bilingual education in law. But it is not something that is binding. Even in any case, it is a policy, it is not a law. That is the first important aspect. And the policy as such, it is not binding. And the other important aspect that we must note is that the policy also states that the state institutions offering law education must consider offering bilingual education. It is not like there are no such deadlines that are prescribed unless the deadlines that are prescribed for other purposes. They only say the state institution must consider offering wherever it is possible. And I'm of the opinion that the state institutions can actually consider it only when the state institutions are actually satisfied that all the legal resources can be made available in the vernacular language in which the legal education can be imparted. That is in addition to English. And it is also important for us to note that the language of the High Court and the Supreme Court continues to be English, under the Constitution, unless the Parliament provides otherwise. The language of the court, both High Court and Supreme Court, continues to be English. So and it is somewhat necessary also because of the fact that the judges to the High Courts also come from different states. Chief Justice, most importantly, come from a different state. And it may not be possible to conduct the judicial proceedings entirely in the vernacular languages, even in the High Court in the states. And it may not be possible in the Supreme Court unless we have a common language. If Hindi or any other language is promoted as a common language. So English would continue to be there. That is the reason why the National Education Policy speaks about bilingual education in law. It is not just about imparting education in a vernacular language. It should be bilingual so that the students and future judges should be able to understand English as well as the regional language. That's maybe desirable in view of the fact that all the documents in the states, in most of the states, are available in vernacular languages, and then translation would also take much time. If they're able to understand the local language, then probably it would be quite handy for lawyers and judges to deal with the cases. So that is the fifth important aspect that I wanted to flag. The next is about autonomy to innovate on matters of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. There are certain prescriptions for all higher education institutions, including the legal education institutions, regarding autonomy to innovate on matters of curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment within the broad framework that is prescribed. Most importantly, the National Education Policy says that curriculum and pedagogy shall be designed by institutions and faculty members to ensure stimulating and engaging learning experiences for all students. And at a different place, the National Education Policy also says faculty autonomy in curriculum design and pedagogy is more important. So now what is happening in legal education by and large, particularly the undergraduate legal education, as regards the postgraduate legal education is concerned, that there is a lot of flexibility that exists for designing the curriculum and the pedagogy and the assessment patterns in most of the universities. With some scrutiny by the departmental bodies, the faculty member concerned would be given such an autonomy. But as far as the undergraduate law is concerned, that it is the Bar Council of India that actually prescribes the curriculum that is to be followed with very little scope for autonomy. So if the legal education is to be brought in tune with the the ideas that are envisaged under the new education policy, then probably even the Bar Council of India or any other regulatory bodies must have to reflect upon the existing practice of prescribing curriculum and pedagogical approach, and then imposing on every educational institution, imposing on every faculty as to how it must be dealt with and what needs to be taught, that they should think of providing greater autonomy to the institutions concerned and the faculties. The second important aspect relating to autonomy of institutions and faculty is that the new education policy says that higher education institutions shall move away from high-stake examination towards more continuous and comprehensive evaluation. Like many other disciplines, even legal education is somewhat examination oriented. In many states, that there will be only an end semester examination conducted at the end of the semester for every paper without any scope for continuous evaluation. That is what the new education policy describes as high-stake examinations. And in some places, there could be some provision for internal assessment for about 20 or 30% of weightage, and for rest of the marks that generally the external examination is conducted at the end of the semester. The new education policy seeks to change this existing practices of conducting high-stake examination at the end of the semester. And it emphasizes more on continuous evaluation and a comprehensive evaluation. What happens with the high-stake end semester examination is that it only ends up testing the cognitive knowledge, the memory. Most of them, it in a way, conducting of the high-stake end semester examination promotes what is called as rote learning. You know, there are people who would rote learn things, and unfortunately, it so happens that in most places who do rote learning end up scoring highest marks. This is the problem with the existing examination system that we have. And that is what the new education policy seeks to change entirely by requiring the higher education institution to move away from such examination towards a more continuous and a comprehensive evaluation. And further, the national education policy requires the higher education institutions to move to a criteria-based grading system that assess student achievement based on the learning goals of each program, making the system fairer and outcomes more comparable. You know, now world over, there is what is called competency-based education system. In fact, this is one of the important aspects that we must note. And currently, the Turing Academy is of the Turing Academy is an academy established in Spain, in the Deusto University of the Spain, and it is it is conducting a project which is funded by the European Union Erasmus project, and it is promoting competency-based education in different parts of the country. And in the last 2 years, they're working in India as well. And they've selected 4 areas for promoting competency-based education in India. One of them is law. The other 3 are medicine, teacher education, and the third one, law, medicine, teacher education, and there is one more, perhaps one more discipline they have. As far as the legal education is concerned, there are 7 Indian universities, both private and public universities, that are involved in the process. And the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I'm currently working, is one of them. And the project is almost halfway through. And the idea of competency-based legal education is to first define competences which every law graduate must acquire at the end of completing a law degree, and then design the courses accordingly to enhance those competences in every candidate, and then also design the exam assessment system in such a way that to truly assess whether a student has actually acquired that competence or not. That's a huge project, and perhaps if I start speaking about it, that would take another 1 hour or so to sum up the whole thing. So that there is already a work in progress to promote what is called the competency-based legal education in India, and only a certain institutions are involved at this stage. Probably once the project is completed, it may be possible to promote it among other legal education institutions as well. That is what even the national education policy is now trying to promote, and the work is already underway. The next important aspect that I would like to flag is what Professor G.B. Reddy has already mentioned in the introduction. That is relating to governance and regulatory changes which the national education policy proposes. to the higher education in general, not just to the legal education. I'll come to the legal education a bit later. The national education policy has noted that the existing regulatory system of higher education is too heavy-handed, and it proposes to completely overhaul the existing governance and regulatory system in the country. As per the new education policy, distinct functions of regulation, accreditation, funding, and academic standard setting shall be performed by distinct, independent, and empowered bodies. It is not one body which concentrates all powers, more or less. Now the University Grants Commission does most of these functions. And the national education policy seeks to differentiate each of them and entrust it to 4 different bodies, which would all, of course, come under an umbrella organization. So it provides for setting up of 4 independent verticals within one umbrella institution called the Higher Education Commission of India. And these 4 vertical institutions within the Higher Education Commission of India would look at the different aspects of governance and regulation. One looks at the regulation, the other accreditation, the third one funding, and the fourth one standard setting, so that there shall be no conflict of interest as well. And these 4 verticals that the national education policy seeks to establish within the Higher Education Commission of India are: number 1, National Higher Education Regulatory Council for the purpose of regulation; National Accreditation Council for the purpose of accreditation, as the name itself suggests; and Higher Education Grants Council for the purpose of funding; and the 4th, the General Education Council for the purpose of setting standards. One of the important points to be noted is that for regulatory purposes, both medical and legal education are excluded from the jurisdiction of National Higher Education Regulatory Council. This is somewhat, of course, not very strange, but in my opinion, excluding them from the purview of the National Higher Education Regulatory Council was somewhat undesirable. Because now the legal education is governed by multiple authorities as of now. Suppose if the institution offering a legal education is a private affiliated college, which of course they seeks to obliterate the affiliation system in course of time, then it is subject to regulation by the university to which it is affiliated, the states in which it works, the state government where it works, and then to the Bar Council of India, and then to the University Grants Commission. There are multiple regulatory authorities. More or less, it is the Bar Council of India which would have a greater regulatory power over legal education institutions in particular. And there have been so many criticisms against the manner in which the Bar Council of India is actually discharging its function as regards recognition of colleges and then inspections that they conduct. There are so many controversies that exist. So it is in this context that we need to look at, is it really desirable? The point is, when the legal education, like the medical education, is excluded from the purview of National Higher Education Regulatory Council, it means that the existing regulatory system over these 2 disciplines would continue. The Medical Council will continue to have control over the medical education. The Bar Council of India will continue to have the control over the education in India, given the implementation of the National Higher Education National Education Policy, because it doesn't contemplate about bringing the legal education also within the general administrative structure, which it is now seeking to establish. So they have been completely excluded, which means that they would continue to be governed by the existing regulatory bodies that are currently governing them. So have my own reservation as to the desirability of such exclusion and the continuation of them under the existing system. But as far as the other three vertical councils are concerned within the Higher Education Commission of India, all the three of them will have jurisdiction over legal and medical education as well. There are, as I said, the four verticals are there within the Higher Education Council of India. It is only from the first vertical, from the jurisdiction of the first vertical, which is the National Higher Education Regulatory Council, that the legal and medical education are excluded, not from the purview of the other three councils that are going to be set up under the Higher Education Council of India. So that means that the body that is going to regulate accreditation, funding, and standard settings, there are three different bodies that are going to be there for these three purposes. All the three bodies would continue to have jurisdiction over even the legal education and the medical education as well, as I understand. But it is only the regulatory council which would not have a jurisdiction over the legal education. And the next important point that I would like to flag is the emphasis of the national education policy and internationalization. This is not something that is relating to only legal education, but the higher education in general. The national education policy aims at having larger number of international students on Indian campuses. Even probably the legal education institutions can also expect. Two, it also provides greater mobility to students studying in India to institutions abroad through what is called credit transfer system. That it is possible under the national education policy for a student to complete part of the course in India and then move on to a different institutions, both in India as well as in abroad, to continue rest. And then there will be, it of course depends on the international cooperation as well. As regards internationalization of education is concerned, India alone cannot decide everything. So it depends on the international understandings that will be evolved over a period of time. But the education policy contemplates about a credit transfer system. It is possible for a student to pursue some of the credit courses that are required for completing a degree program in India, to pursue some of the credit courses abroad, and then require the higher education institution in India to count those credit that he has acquired there for the purpose of awarding degree programs. There is that much of a flexibility that the national education system, education policy is contemplating. And third, the national education policy also contemplates that high-performing Indian universities can set up campuses abroad. There is no, of course, definition of high-performing Indian universities under the policy as such. In course of time, the competent bodies are going to define them. So which means to say that even the educational institutions imparting legal education in India, if they meet the standards that are prescribed to be called as high-performing Indian universities, then they can possibly think of setting up their campuses abroad, whether state or private universities. They can set up their campuses abroad. And reciprocally, the national education policy also contemplates allowing the universities abroad, if they are within the top 100 in the global ranking, to operate in India. That the foreign universities, foreign education institutions, including the legal education institutions, can come in India and set up educational institutions. So this was proposed a few years back, and which was, of course, criticized very much in certain quarters. But now the education policy itself says that the top 100 universities from abroad can come and set up the campuses in India and operate and impart education in different disciplines, including in the law discipline as well. And the national education policy also contemplates about research collaboration and student exchange programs. That is another important aspect. The next important aspect that I would like to flag is about the master's programs and the PhD programs in law. Of course, the emphasis is in law, but we need to understand what kind of impact the national education policy would have on master's and PhD programs in law in the light of overall changes the national education policy is proposing for the higher education in general. In my opinion, master's education, master's programs in general, may lose their importance after introduction of a 4-year degree with research program. As per the national education policy, a person with a 4-year research degree can directly enroll for PhD. And the national education policy also proposes for introduction of a master's program in every discipline, either 1 year or 2-year degree programs. As far as law is concerned, we already have a 1-year LLM program, and some of the universities are continuing to offer 2-year degree program. Excepting for the master's in law, in all other disciplines, the master's degree program is a minimum of 2 years duration. And now, since there has been a change, structural change proposed to the undergraduate program under the new education policy, it also proposed changes to the master's program as well. It proposes for offering of either 1 or 2-year master's degree program in every discipline. Suppose if a student has done a 3-year degree program, which is possible, then he may have to pursue a 2-year master's program. If a student has done a 4-year degree program without research component in it, then the person can actually pursue a 1-year degree program. But why I say the master's degree program might actually lose their significance in course of time is because of the 4-year degree programs, there will be 2 varieties that the national education policy contemplates. One, they call it as 4-year multidisciplinary degree program, and the other 4-year multidisciplinary program with research component in case if the student has undertaken a quality research during that 4-year degree program, then that is called the degree with research, 4-year degree with research. And under the new education policy in all of the disciplines, that if a person has a 4-year degree program with research, then he can actually directly enroll for a PhD program without doing masters. In most of the European countries, actually master's degree do not have so much of importance, values. And undergraduate degree is sufficient to enroll for a PhD, and India is also seems to be moving towards that. So when in other disciplines, there is a chance that the master's degree program is likely to lose their importance, is it desirable to insist for master's degree in law to enroll for a PhD? Now, we insist for either a 1-year master's degree to enroll for a PhD. And in any case, when a 4-year degree holder can directly enroll for PhD in other disciplines, in law, a person invests 5 years after completion of the 10+2, or in case of a 3-year degree, the person actually enroll for 3-year degree after completion of a 3 or in course of probably a 4-year degree in future, and invest another 3 years for acquiring a law degree. Is it desirable and fair to insist that in case if you want to do a PhD in law, you must necessarily do a master's program in law, whereas people pursuing education in other disciplines are exempted? This is what we need to think about. As regards the master's and the PhD program. And there is one more important aspect that I would like to flag. That is about the design of the PhD programs. Generally now, after the 2009 PhD regulation of the UGC, the coursework has been made mandatory. Though there are no specification as to what has to be mandatorily taught during the coursework except for the research component. Now that they emphasize that 50% of the weightage in the coursework should be given for the research. What is important is that the new education policy now says that all fresh PhD entrants, irrespective of the discipline, will be required to take credit-based courses in teaching, education, pedagogy, writing related to their chosen PhD subjects during their doctoral training period, which we call as coursework period now. Whether a person intends to join academics or not after pursuing PhD, that is immaterial. But if a person has enrolled for a PhD, he must, during the doctoral training period, during the coursework period, take credit-based courses in teaching, education, pedagogy, and writing. So the existing courseworks that we are offering for PhD students in different universities may have to be revisited and modified suitably to ensure that these components are actually included as credit courses in particular for all PhD students to mandatorily take, irrespective of whether they're interested in joining academics or not on completion of the PhD. They must be trained in teaching, education, pedagogy, and writing skill. Writing, of course, is very much important. That's also another important point that we should note. And there are many other aspects that the National Education Policy deal with. And to very briefly mention, because it's already about 6:13 or so, and we might have some time for the discussion after my presentation. So let me flag one or two things very quickly. The other important thing is about, as I mentioned in the beginning, the National Education Policy contemplates about setting up of two kinds of universities. One is teaching intensive university and another is research intensive universities. So even the legal education institution can also think of either becoming a teaching intensive institution or a research intensive institution. I understand that some of the universities, the state and the central university, if you particularly look, do not actually offer undergraduate degrees. They only have departments of law offering postgraduate degree programs plus the PhD. I think they don't qualify to be a teaching intensive university as such. They shall be considered as a research intensive universities, and I think that in course of time there will be separate criteria that are going to be set for to decide the workload for teaching intensive and research intensive universities. Even now we have some universities which are research intensive, some universities which are teaching incentives. Unfortunately, when it comes to the API points for the faculties that needs to be acquired for seeking promotion, there are uniform criteria that are laid down for both teaching intensive universities and research intensive universities. Whereas in teaching intensive universities, teachers actually lack research, the points that they can score on research, and the vice versa. Some of the research intensive universities do not have adequate teaching load on teachers, like JNU, for example. We do not have like 16 or 12 hours teaching load with the UGC mandates because it is a research intensive universities. So now that the National Education Policy specifically recognizes that there can be two set of universities, one is teaching intensive and another is research intensive, that probably a different criteria may have to be evolved. And the other two important points that I would like to flag out, one is the research funding by National Research Funding Agency that is going to be set up. Even for legal research, I hope that there will be now adequate funding that will be made available. And the last point that I would like to stress before I conclude is about the commercialization of education. This is also a general point that the National Education Policy deal with, and commercialization of education is also very rampant in legal education, and the legal education policy seeks to regulate this aspect, and hope that probably they will be able to address some of the core issues relating to commercialization, which actually denies access to vast majority of aspiring students to join law courses in private colleges, because the state universities are limited, which are offering legal education at an affordable price. National law universities are too expensive, and private universities, some of them are running with a profit motive. So the National Education Policy seeks to address the problem. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that just as I began by saying that this is a policy and it is not a legal instrument. It is not binding on the government. One cannot hold the government accountable. And even if you look at the two other policies in the past, as some of the educationists have pointed out recently in the discussions, that none of the education policies have been fully implemented. And this policy in particular flags that the policy as a whole needs to be implemented if the goals set out are to be realized. So lot depends on the state now. State in the sense I'm talking about both the union and the state. It is most important for us to note, even the education policy has noted that education is a federal subject, it's a concurrent subject. Both the state and the center have a role to play. They have a legislative competence to enact laws relating to education, and they also, because it is the concurrent subject, I would also say that it is the responsibility of both the state and the center to ensure that education is made available and accessible to everyone. So a lot depends on what steps that are going to be taken in course of time for implementation of each of these policies. And there are different deadlines that are for realizing different goals and targets, and the maximum being 2040, another 20 years. Some of the other goals, like making education existing monodisciplinary institutes and universities multidisciplinary, they intend to achieve it by 2035, and some of the other goals are immediately achievable. So it is important now for us. The policy as a whole seems good. By and large, there are no such really objectionable things of any sort included in the policy. There are, of course, few things where one can have a different opinion. Even I do have different opinion, a few aspects, that is, but by and large, the policy is a good one, and it is going to have a drastic implication on legal education as well. And this can be understood, as I said in the beginning, not only by looking at those sections where they made explicit reference to legal education, because the implication needs to be understood in the light of overall changes the policy proposes to the higher education in general. And what I have flagged are actually some of the important ones which I could find, but on a more closer reading of the national education policy, one can actually come up with many other additional points as to the national education policy would have on legal education. With this, I hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Puneet, sir. The first question, sir, why there is no free education in Null, sir, which is a national law college? Is it not amount to denial of education to poor students in national law colleges?
Okay. One important point that we should note is that higher education is not a fundamental right in India. Now, after the Constitution 86th Amendment, the education from the age group of 6 to 14 is made fundamental rights. And the national education policy seeks to expand it till 18 years, from 3 to 18. It seems that the national education policy seeks to expand it because they intend to achieve 100% education till 18 years in course of time. That is the target that they fixed. There is some deadline that they fixed. They want to ensure that there are no dropouts till 18 years. That means to say up to +2 they intend to cover, and instead of 6 to 18 they intend to now cover from 3 to 18. There is an expansion of the free and compulsory education with the national education policy proposes. But as regards the higher education is concerned, their only target is to achieve. Now there is the enrollment ratio in higher education is about 26% or so in India. Their target is to achieve 50% by 2040 or so. Now, I don't actually remember the deadlines that they have fixed. Because there are multiple deadlines fixed for different purposes, but the target is to achieve 50% enrollment. In any case, the idea is also not to reach. It is, of course, maybe impossible to reach 100% enrollment ratio. So, but what is important as far as the national education policy is concerned, that it is stressing more on state investment in the education. It is saying that now the investment in education is up to 4 point some percentage of the GDP. If you take into account both the union and the state investments in education, they intend to increase it to 6% or so. But even then, it won't be sufficient to provide higher education as a matter of right to everyone. So there are provisions that are being made, different schemes are proposed. And even the national education policy also emphasizes on expansion and inclusion to provide education to more and more people. So in course of time, there will be more number of educational institutions that are going to be set up if the policy is to be strictly implemented, and more opportunities would be made available through scholarship and various other means. Even the national education policy emphasizes on private education institutions also offering more scholarships for the students who cannot afford to pay the fee, so they should get a scholarship. So there is a proposal for expansion so that even the underprivileged sections of the society, the education policy uses the phrase socially and economically disadvantaged groups. That's the phrase that is used. There are certain special provisions that are to be made, and it imposes obligation on the state and also expect the private universities to offer scholarship. In course of time, probably the coverage would be wider, we guess. But as regards why in a particular university or institution that the fees is so much that the people from underprivileged sections of the society cannot afford to get education, it's difficult for us to understand. I do not know about the Nalsar in particular. Do they offer any scholarship? Because some of the national schools offer scholarships to those who qualify in the entrance examination, but who are not in a position to pay the fee, the tuition fee and other fees that are required. They get scholarships there. And some of the organizations are also working to ensure. Earlier, the organization that was headed by, there was a leading IP professor who has recently passed away, who was running an organization to ensure that Shamnath Bashir, to ensure that the underprivileged sections of the society should also get to national law schools. But unfortunately, in India, no one can claim as a matter of right the higher education enrollment into a higher education institution. It is only the elementary education which is made free and compulsory, and one can claim as a matter of right. So we'll have to wait for long, perhaps, and it's unfortunate though, to see the day when everyone who is eligible and aspiring to pursue education gets an opportunity to study, irrespective of his or her financial conditions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Next question, sir. Sir, the NEP 2020 is a good document, but please explain whether its job would help to depoliticize the educational system.
Okay, that's in fact a very interesting question. I have actually watched some of the discussions that are held, and there is nothing so objectionable as far as the education policy is concerned. There was an apprehension that many have had that if the current government frames the education policy, then probably there will be a scope for saffronization of education. But there is nothing of the sort that is found in the education policy. That it is completely fair and holistic, so to say. But is there anything to depoliticize in the education policy? I would say education policy, as like any other policy, is framed in a broad and general term, which can be implemented in a multiple ways. So at the time of implementation, how do we design specific rules and regulations for implementation of the policy? And when the autonomy for development of the course curriculum and pedagogy is institutions and individuals, then it depends on those institutions and individuals and the regulatory bodies and the men or women who are going to head those regulatory bodies as to whether there will be a scope for politics in future or not. But I don't find apparently anything more objectionable in the education policy as such, which would give scope or give rise for politicization of the education as such. It seems more holistic, but it can happen. It can happen. No one can rule it out, because this is not a document which specifically deals with every minute aspects. Perhaps no policy document deal with every minute aspect of it. So as it is generally said, the devil lies in the details. We'll have to see how the details are to be worked out in future for implementation of the national education policy to comment upon such things. That's what I said in the beginning. No one can accurately the project estimate what kind of implication it is going to have, because a lot of it is going to be dependent on the specific details that are going to be framed in future. And this is a broad and a general guideline, and based on which no one can actually predict every possibility. So thank you.
Sir, is it advisable to incorporate law as a subject as one of the papers in +2 and degree course? This is two participants have asked the same question, sir. Why was not legal education made compulsory at the 10+2 level, as it would have provided more job opportunities?
I do not know how making legal education compulsory at +2 level gives job opportunities. In some of the states, like the state of Karnataka, teaching of certain law courses at all undergraduate level is made mandatory, whether a person is pursuing BA, BSc, or BCom, or engineering or medicine. In Karnataka, the constitution is mandatorily to be taught, I think, as a non-credit course or so. In some places, they also require environmental law to be taught. That is the existing thing. But as far as the national education policy is concerned, why do they emphasize on multidisciplinary universities and flexibility for students to select courses? Is to ensure that a person studying, say for example, any, like the science, say for example, BSc, if he or she is interested to pursue a law course, say for example in IPR, or law and technology, cyber law, then they shall be able to take some credit courses in the law department as well, and those credit courses would count even when they would count for the award of the degree, because there will be minimum requirement of credits for the award of the degree. That is what the new education policy contemplates. That is the reason as to why a new education policy is contemplating about multidisciplinary universities. In JNU, it is already a practice. In fact, I offer a open elective course for master students in JNU, and most of my students actually come from different centers. They are actually pursuing MA political science or so, or MA sociology. They would come and take my course on constitutional law. I have a course on constitutional rights and remedies, and majority of them actually come from the other centers. So it is possible in the multidisciplinary universities for students to take courses from other disciplines, and even that's another important aspect as far as the impact on legal education is concerned. We may have to allow students pursuing undergraduate or postgraduate degrees to take credit courses from other centers as well. That is what the national education policy envisions. So it will be possible in future for students studying in different disciplines to take even the law courses, which they think as more appropriate and beneficial for them.
Yes, thank you, sir. Sir, next question, sir. As law is a professional degree course, do you think compulsory internship should be introduced throughout the law colleges in India, as it will be helpful to enhance practical knowledge for law students?
Yeah, if you're asking for my opinion, the answer is yes. The answer is yes, but it should not be like a shabby and a formal thing. Internship is not working very effectively in every institutions. It should not become like holidaying during the internship. There needs to be a proper framework that needs to be evolved by each higher education institution to ensure that the students actually learn during the internship, and what they learn during the internship should be appropriately assessed by the higher educational institutions. And again, going back to the national education policy, it in fact aims at incorporating the internship component even at the school level. That even the school children should go for the internship during the vacation or during the weekends. It contemplates that. And when the national education policy emphasizes more on continuous and comprehensive assessment, it emphasizes on learning skills.
Yes, sir.
So, which can be, and the autonomy for designing curriculum and pedagogy should actually give liberty for each higher education institutions to incorporate the internship component. And incorporating it would be completely in tune with the new higher education, the principles of the new higher education policy.
Sir, to what extent is this new educational policy helpful to the students? Whether is it beneficial to them in practical manner?
Absolutely. My answer is yes. No doubt about it. In many ways, number one, that it is going to comprehensively overhaul the education system, and it is going to be somewhat, if it is truly implemented in letter and spirit, it is going to be really beneficial for the students to acquire multiple skills. And now under the existing system, what happens if you enroll, for example, for a BSc, Bachelor of Science, and even if you are interested in any other course, you will not be able to take that course in other disciplines, but the new education policy allows. Number one. Two, that, as I said before, the flexibility that is made available to the students under the new education policy. That if a student, for whatever reason, is not able to complete the entire degree program at once, and if he wants to exit after completion of 1 year or 2 years, the new education policy allows that, and the time that he has invested will not be waste, because the credits that he has acquired is going to be deposited in the credit deposit, the what is called the ABC. There is a credit deposit for, there is a body that is going to be established for the purpose of digitally depositing the credits, and which they can make use of in future. Suppose in future, if they can actually continue the education, they don't have to start from zero. They will start from the second year onwards, and the earlier credits would count. And even if they're not able to continue education forever to complete that, then they would get a certificate after completion of 1 year, they would get a diploma after completion of 2 years, or they would get a degree after completion of 3 years, even if they're not able to complete the course. So there is a lot of flexibility that is allowed to the students. If you look at the policy more closely, perhaps one can find many more things which are more beneficial for the students under the national education policy. Whatever was more rigid and strict earlier, there is a great amount of flexibility is now available to the students, even for choosing the courses, to decide whether they should study at once or take break in between, or they should study in one institution, or after completion of 1 or 2 years move on to one university to another university, because the credit will count, they will all be deposited, and their transferable credit transfer is made easy. And even if they want to go abroad, I think there is a provision for credit transfer between universities in 2 different countries. If there is a understanding that exists between the 2 universities, there is a lot of flexibility, and one can find many more things which are beneficial to the students.
Taken more of your time in the question and answer session, sir. Thank you for your patiently answering the questions, and also your elaborate lecture, sir, on the national educational policy. On behalf of the Department of Law, Osmania University, I would like to propose vote of thanks to you, sir. In your lecture, you have highlighted about the multidisciplinary universities that are to be formed under the national education policy, the teaching intensive and research intensive institutions, and the timeline till 2030, which has been enshrined for the national law universities, national law schools to become multidisciplinary with about 3,000 students, and the change that is to be made in the modes of examination with shift in focus from rote learning to practical learning. You have also highlighted the aspects about the 4 years degrees and the research degrees, and also the significant role of BCI in legal education, even under the national educational policy. And also you have touched upon the issues of internationalization and the national educational policy, the credit transfer system, and the high performing universities that can set up campuses abroad. And also you have told us about the impact of the national educational policy on masters and PhD programs in law. Finally, you have also analyzed the commercialization of education and also legal education, and how the national educational policy may be a tool in reducing such commercialization. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and for agreeing to be the resource person for this session. And we have learned a lot from your session, sir. Thank you very much, and we look forward to have more sessions from you in future also, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Irfan, and thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity, and also all the participants for the patient hearing. Thank you very much.